There is a strange truth that sits beneath the surface of every modern economy, and most people never realize it. The biggest financial decisions shaping their lives today were actually made decades ago, sometimes even centuries earlier, by people they have never heard of and systems they never voted for. These decisions were not just policies or agreements. They were turning points, moments when leaders and financiers set rules that quietly bent the future in their direction. What makes this even more mysterious is that the influence of those choices has not faded with time. Instead, it has strengthened, spreading through generations like a current that never stops moving. If you follow this current long enough, you reach unexpected places. You begin to see how certain systems grew powerful, not because they were perfect, but because they were built early. You notice how global markets still respond to patterns created by old agreements. You notice how nations behave according to financial structures they can adjust, but cannot completely escape. And somewhere along the way, you realize that today's world is not just modern, it is inherited. Almost every major financial routine we accept as normal has roots in decisions made long before any of us were born. This story does not begin with technology, markets, or even globalization. It begins with a basic need, the need for a stable measure of value. Early societies understood that without something trusted, trade would collapse and development would stall. But the choice of what to trust did not come easily. It involved power, persuasion, and strategy. Some rulers centralized control to strengthen their influence. Others spread responsibility to gain cooperation. The more their decisions were repeated, the stronger they became. What seemed like simple choices slowly turned into foundations. These foundations became even more influential when global trade expanded. Nations realized that controlling the structure of money could be more powerful than controlling land or resources. If you controlled value, you controlled decision-making. If you controlled decision-making, you shaped the future. What is even more fascinating is that these early systems grew at different speeds. Some regions advanced quickly, others waited. But once a few major players established rules about value, exchange, and settlement, the rest of the world had to adjust, not because they agreed, but because they had no alternative. As time passed, the world witnessed the rise of financial hubs. These hubs did not appear randomly. They were built through a combination of consistent policies, reliable institutions, and leaders who understood the advantage of influence. When a country offered stability, traders came. When traders came, capital followed. When capital followed, power shifted. What started as a logical solution to organize value slowly turned into a network where decisions made by a small circle could echo across continents. This network expanded dramatically during the 19th and 20th centuries. Industrial growth demanded larger financial systems. Railways, factories, ports, and cities needed funding, and funding required trust. Certain countries positioned themselves at the center of this trust by offering rules that looked predictable and systems that appeared strong. Investors from around the world placed their confidence in these centers. They believed these hubs would not collapse and would not change their rules. Suddenly, that belief created a cycle. The more trust a system received, the more powerful it became. The more powerful it became, the harder it was for others to challenge it. But behind this growth, something else was happening. As countries adopted similar financial structures, they unknowingly tied themselves to old decisions created in earlier eras, decisions about value, decisions about reserves, decisions about settlement, decisions about risk. These choices were shaped by their own time, yet they still define how modern markets behave. They still determine which currencies lead global trade. They still influence how governments respond to crises. And they still guide how capital moves when uncertainty rises. One of the most striking features of this entire history is how the same patterns reappear. Whenever major financial powers rise, they do so by offering predictability. Whenever they fall, it usually happens because the very systems they relied on become too rigid to adapt. Every cycle has the same sequence: early innovation, growing confidence, rapid expansion, pressure, imbalance, and realignment. The people living through these cycles often believe their era is different. But the deeper you look, the clearer it becomes that the structure of money follows laws that ignore eras, leaders, and borders. As these cycles unfolded, the world drifted toward a more interconnected financial landscape. Nations needed each other to stabilize trade, to support currencies, and to prevent disruptions. Yet this interconnection also made them more vulnerable. A decision made in one powerful center could send ripples across half the world. A policy designed for local stability could trigger global movement, and a shift in confidence could redirect billions in a matter of hours. The speed of these reactions may be modern, but the underlying mechanics are old. They are built on principles introduced long before digital screens existed. This brings us to a turning point. The world we live in today is shaped by decisions that were considered necessary during earlier periods. Some were made to create certainty, some were meant to strengthen influence, and some were made simply because no one imagined how large financial systems would become. These decisions combined into a structure that now governs markets, shapes policies, and influences nearly every major economic event. We now move deeper into the story, where old decisions collide with modern realities, and the systems inherited from history face pressures they were never designed to handle. As the world entered the 20th century, these inherited financial systems began to interact with unprecedented scale and speed. Industrialization had created cities, transportation networks, and industries that relied on constant streams of capital. Governments increasingly borrowed to fund wars, infrastructure, and social programs, but the terms of borrowing were always influenced by choices made decades before. The rules governing credit, currency reserves, and international settlement created pathways for money to flow often quietly, invisibly but with extraordinary power. Those who understood the system could anticipate where resources would go, while the rest of the population remained largely unaware of the currents shaping their economy. Major global events, wars, depressions, booms were no longer isolated incidents. They became interconnected waves, amplified by the structure of money itself. A financial decision made in London could ripple to New York, Tokyo, or Geneva before policymakers fully understood what had happened. Yet the world rarely acknowledged this hidden link. People saw only the visible outcomes: a stock market crash, a currency devaluation, or a sudden rise in interest rates. The causes were buried in layers of historical precedent, compounded by decades of institutional habits. The rising complexity of financial institutions also played a role. Banks, trusts, and clearinghouses grew larger and more centralized. These institutions were designed to maintain stability, but their very concentration created vulnerability. When a crisis emerged, it was rarely localized. The interconnected networks meant that stress in one region spread rapidly. Decisions about lending, investment, and liquidity that had seemed prudent in isolation suddenly had consequences far beyond their original intent. And in every case, the underlying architecture was still shaped by history, by rules, treaties, and conventions that originated long before modern economic theories took hold. Yet the system had its guardians. Central banks, regulatory authorities, and supranational organizations were created to manage these flows, to intervene when necessary, and to provide reassurance to markets. Still, their actions often followed patterns rather than foresight. Interventions were reactive because the structural dependencies of the financial system meant that early warning signals were subtle, dispersed, and often misunderstood. A sudden drop in confidence might not be recognized as part of a larger historical pattern until it had already triggered movement in capital flows and market adjustments. One of the most striking examples of these repeating patterns can be seen in periods of global debt accumulation. Governments borrowed to stimulate growth, banks extended credit to maintain liquidity, and investors sought returns in increasingly sophisticated instruments. On the surface, these decisions appeared rational and necessary, but beneath the surface, they were constrained by decades-old frameworks for managing currency value, repayment structures, and cross-border obligations. The very mechanisms designed to facilitate growth and security created cycles of vulnerability. When stress reached a tipping point, the consequences were often swift and severe, even when the original decisions seemed distant or disconnected from modern realities. This interplay between historical precedent and contemporary pressure creates a paradox. The financial systems that enable prosperity also embed constraints that can amplify risk. Every policy, every regulation, and every structural rule carries the imprint of past decisions, which often clash with the demands of modern economies. And while observers may see only the immediate results, recessions, inflation, sudden market shifts, the deeper story lies in the continuity of these systems. They are inherited legacies, not accidental outcomes. Recognizing this continuity transforms our understanding of modern economics. Crises are rarely unprecedented. They are echoes of structural patterns established long ago. Booms are not spontaneous. They are the predictable outcomes of systems designed to channel capital efficiently. And success in navigating these systems depends less on luck or timing, and more on understanding the historical architecture that underlies every financial choice. Investors, policymakers, and ordinary citizens alike are influenced by decisions that were made decades, sometimes centuries, earlier and which continue to define the flow of money, opportunity, and risk. As this historical influence intersects with modern technology, globalization, and instantaneous communication, the pace of impact has accelerated. Decisions that once took months or years to propagate now travel across continents in minutes. Markets respond not only to present events but to interpretations of historical patterns, algorithms designed to detect trends, and collective expectations shaped by centuries of financial precedent. The systems that control today's wealth are not new. They are the cumulative result of historical choices interacting with modern innovation, creating a network of influence that is both invisible and immense. From these observations, three essential lessons begin to emerge. First, the present is inseparable from the past. Understanding history is critical to anticipating outcomes. Second, the apparent independence of nations, markets, or financial institutions is often illusory. They operate within frameworks established long ago. Third, the power to influence wealth, growth, and stability lies as much in understanding systemic rules as in responding to immediate events. Those who grasp the invisible architecture of finance gain insight that is otherwise unavailable, allowing them to act with foresight instead of reaction. The story is far from over. Modern crises, technological innovations, and policy shifts continue to interact with historical structures, shaping outcomes in ways that are predictable if one knows where to look and surprising if one does not. As we move toward the final phase of this narrative, the focus shifts to the breaking points, the unintended consequences of inherited rules, and the patterns that repeat across generations. Here lies the critical insight. The past is never past, and the decisions made by history's financial architects continue to dictate the flow of wealth, power, and opportunity across the world. As inherited financial rules encounter modern pressures, breaking points emerge in ways that few anticipate. These moments are rarely sudden. They build quietly, through subtle imbalances and growing reliance on systems designed for a different era. National debts accumulate, credit expands, and confidence in currencies becomes intertwined with historical frameworks that may no longer be resilient. Markets react before crises appear visible because the underlying structures, crafted decades or centuries earlier, dictate the speed and direction of change. Financial tension is not random. It follows patterns that echo across time. When these pressures finally surface, the consequences ripple quickly and widely. Stock markets plunge, currencies fluctuate, and investment flows redirect as confidence shifts. What seems like a modern shock is often the culmination of decisions layered across generations. Attempts to stabilize systems sometimes alleviate immediate symptoms, but rarely address the structural roots. Emergency interventions, interest adjustments, or bailouts can temporarily halt collapse, yet the underlying framework continues to channel risk, ensuring that cycles will repeat. History shows that without systemic adaptation, these patterns of boom, pressure, and correction remain inevitable. The fallout from these structural limitations affects not just investors or policymakers but ordinary citizens, often in ways they barely perceive. Savings lose value, job markets tighten, and government programs strain under unexpected demand. The power of historical financial decisions becomes visible in everyday life. People experience the consequences of choices made long before they were born, as if guided by an invisible hand, shaping opportunities, constraints, and outcomes. In many cases, this explains why certain economies struggle to recover or why wealth concentration intensifies during times of crisis. The systems themselves, rather than individual actors, exert the most lasting influence. Efforts to correct or improve these systems often confront the same recurring problem. Legacy rules are difficult to fully reverse. Structural constraints, treaties, central bank mandates, and international agreements limit flexibility. Innovations in policy or technology can provide temporary relief, but without altering the foundational principles that govern value, exchange, and credit. These fixes cannot prevent recurring patterns. Observers frequently perceive crises as isolated events or policy failures, but in truth, they are structural echoes from decisions made decades or centuries earlier, amplified by contemporary complexity. Despite these challenges, understanding the historical foundation of financial systems offers powerful insights. By recognizing repeating patterns, it becomes possible to anticipate outcomes rather than merely react. Analysts, investors, and policymakers who study cycles, inherited rules, and the invisible architecture of money gain a strategic advantage. They can observe subtle early signals, shifts in liquidity, concentration of debt, or currency pressure that indicate where the system is likely to strain. Recognizing these signals does not eliminate risk, but it transforms uncertainty into actionable insight. As we consider the modern parallels, the lesson becomes increasingly clear. The same mechanisms that shaped global economies centuries ago continue to dictate the flow of wealth today. Digital currencies, instantaneous transactions, and globalized trade amplify the impact of historical frameworks. Crises that once unfolded over years can now play out in days or even hours. Power remains concentrated in nodes that were established long ago, and the rules embedded in those nodes continue to influence policy, investment, and opportunity worldwide. Understanding this continuity is not merely academic. It is essential for anyone seeking to navigate modern finance. From this exploration, three critical takeaways emerge. First, history is not background. It is active and ongoing. Decisions made long ago continue to influence modern financial flows, shaping opportunities, risks, and systemic vulnerabilities. Second, financial crises are rarely accidental. They are predictable outcomes of structural patterns. Understanding these patterns allows individuals and institutions to act with foresight instead of reaction. Third, concentrated knowledge of systemic rules creates strategic advantage. Those who comprehend the invisible architecture of money can anticipate shifts, protect resources, and make informed choices. Yet this insight carries a warning. The inherited financial system, for all its sophistication and efficiency, is inherently fragile. The very rules that create stability also embed constraints that amplify stress when conditions change. Ignoring these patterns, or assuming that modern interventions can fully override historical structures, risks repeating the mistakes of the past. Awareness, vigilance, and informed decision-making are the only tools that mitigate the consequences of cycles we cannot completely eliminate. For the individual, this knowledge invites reflection. Understanding how history shapes present financial realities empowers better decision-making, whether managing personal wealth, evaluating investment opportunities, or simply interpreting economic news. For society, the lesson is even broader. Policies, reforms, and systemic changes must respect the weight of inherited structures while innovating in ways that anticipate future pressures. Only by acknowledging the past can leaders design systems capable of sustaining prosperity without repeating destructive cycles. In the end, the story of money, decisions, and inherited frameworks is a story of continuity and consequence. The choices of the past continue to reverberate, quietly guiding markets, shaping nations, and influencing daily life. By observing patterns, recognizing historical context, and acting with insight, it is possible to navigate these invisible currents with clarity and purpose. And while the full scope of influence remains hidden from most, the lessons embedded in history provide the key to understanding not just why the world behaves as it does, but how we can engage with it more wisely. As you consider the lessons of history, remember this: financial systems are not static. They evolve, interact, and respond to human behavior. They reward those who understand their architecture and challenge those who ignore it. By studying the origins, growth, and recurring patterns of money and power, we can approach economic decisions with perspective, anticipate change before it becomes crisis, and recognize the true mechanics that govern wealth across time. The past is never past. It is active, it is present, and it is the guide to the future.